Sometimes it can feel like everything has already been said about climate change. Because the science is clear. Human activities in terms of greenhouse gases emissions have unequivocally caused global warming. These have been confirmed by the IPCC 2023 report, so there is no uncertainty about the causes. However, the way we talk about mitigation actions remains locked within a framework of endless economic growth. Take the Competitiveness Compass for the EU, for example. It's a plan that has been published in January 2025 with the aim to revive Europe's economic prosperity. It frames decarbonization not as an urgent environmental or social necessity, but as a tool to boost productivity together with innovation and security. But to what extent does this approach allow for structural change at the end? In this episode, I speak with Cass Hebron, founder of The Green Fix, a newsletter that cuts through the noise to make climate politics more accessible to the public. Cass shared with me her activist journey, and we explored the challenges of building real community action in the attention economy, so this is not so easy to do, as well as how optimism can be embraced by activists and where climate activism can go next. Hello Cass, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
Hi, thank you.
I would like to start this episode by talking about your personal journey. So I would like to ask you if you could describe activist journey and the Green Fix project. What motivated you to create such an initiative?
Sure. I've been an activist for about 7 years now, and it started when I was a student at university, where I was really interested in language and communication. And around the same time, I became interested in sustainability, mainly because I was on a budget and I was trying to save money. So I was going to secondhand shops to get my clothes, get books, and I got really into it. So I got really into the whole culture of thrifting, and the more I got into it, the more I read online about the other benefits of shopping secondhand in terms of reducing waste, avoiding funding human rights exploitation in sweatshops, and the impact that the fast fashion industry was having around the world. And this was really the first time that I connected my individual lifestyle to what was happening on a global scale. So I thought there needs to be more accessible information about what people can do to make a difference to what is happening around the world without needing to be an expert. So that sort of took me on a trajectory of writing about sustainability and writing about the climate, which eventually led me a few years later to start The Green Fix. The Green Fix is a climate justice newsletter. We brand ourselves as a bullshit-free climate justice newsletter. And the idea is that we make topics in climate justice understandable and accessible to anyone that wants to make a difference at a systemic level but doesn't know where to start. So most of our audience are young adults or young professionals who are eco-anxious. They are trying as hard as they can to be sustainable on an individual level, but we want to connect that to change at a political and economic level. And we also organize events. We do that in Brussels and also online as a group of volunteers. What triggered the Green Fix specifically was that I was working for an advocacy NGO as an intern, and I was working on the European Green Deal. And at the same time, this was when the Save the Amazon campaign was happening on social media, and a lot of my friends were messaging saying how they felt so powerless, they didn't know what to do, but they also hadn't even heard of the Green Deal. They didn't know what was happening at EU level, because why would they? It's not transparent, it's not obvious, there is not much of an effort on the EU side to better involve citizens in these very complicated policies. So I thought there needs to be a bridge between these citizens and between what is happening politically. Firstly, to inform citizens, but also make them aware of when there are gaps in the system and when they are pushing through laws that will affect everyone, but that you don't even know that you can influence. So that's why I launched the newsletter. I was mainly annoyed, and it sort of grew from there.
It's a good start, when you feel annoyed by something. And I would like to stress one word that you said before, that is accessible. You started to do that project because you were feeling that there was like a lack of information available about the stuff that you care about. And also, it can be a challenge to find valid information that are accessible, that are direct, that are so easy to digest. Can also fuel a particular mental disorder. At least it was defined like that by the Wall Street Journal in 2023. There was a wonderful article. They were saying that eco-anxiety is just the emotional response to climate change. And they were defining this term just like a mental disorder. So something that is an individual thing that you need to resolve by yourself. You were saying that the Green Fix approach this emotion. What are your personal thoughts on this in the context of activism? How do you embrace this?
Well, firstly, I think that I do also question the idea that eco-anxiety is an illness or a disorder when it's a very rational reaction to seeing the extent of climate degradation and political inaction happening around the world and how it jeopardizes our own futures, our natural habitats, and the future for the generations that have not yet been born. It's hard to know what the healthy reaction is supposed to be, if not anxiety and stress and this sense of existentialism. At the same time, that's not a great way to function day to day if you're constantly in this sort of paralysis of fear and hopelessness. And I know that I've experienced eco-anxiety, which has also been called climate grief, a few times. Working in this sector, working in advocacy, it's extremely difficult to see continuous reports about how biodiversity is declining, pollution is increasing, deforestation is increasing, planetary tipping points are being, almost all of them have been passed now. And at the same time, politicians at the national and international level do little to nothing about it. A pledge is not the same as action, and there are plenty of pledges, but we see very little action on the ground from the countries that are most responsible for climate change and for climate action. And of course, in that situation, it's paralyzing, and particularly when I was a couple of years into working in Brussels, it was very consuming. I didn't know how I was supposed to receive all of this information and constantly package it in a positive and motivational way to the people that were being affected. It felt sort of disingenuous, and also I felt the impact that it would have on my life, but also knowing that I'm very privileged here in the global north and that there are already people in the global south that don't have the privilege to be eco-anxious because they have already lost their homes, they have already lost their livelihoods, and they don't have the time to agonize about it on the internet in the way that we do here. So in the Green Fix, we do talk about eco-anxiety and burnout. I do think these two things are very linked for activists and for anyone working in advocacy, that if you are in this constant state of anxiety and stress and you don't find any outlet, that it very quickly evolves into a burnout or chronic stress situation. We try to find a balance between addressing and acknowledging it and providing solutions while recognizing that the long-term solution is beyond what I as an individual can do. The long-term solution is, of course, climate justice. And in the short term, what we can do is talk about it. I noticed that when I started sharing my experience on burnout and on eco-anxiety, that I got a lot of reactions from readers online saying, "Oh, I'm so glad that you're talking about this. I thought that I was the only one." And this was so surprising to me. I thought, how can you think that you're the only one that is feeling anxious and overwhelmed? And it's because these kinds of feelings are still stigmatized. They're stigmatized on a social level where we don't talk about our emotions, particularly in these Western cultures, where the idea that you repress your feelings as a sign of strength and resilience is still very prevalent, particularly in the workplace and among men. And it's stigmatized even within activism movements and NGO movements, because we're so afraid that if we say that we are afraid and anxious, that it will demoralize the movement to the point that we don't move forward, because it's not very compelling messaging. So all this leads to a culture of general silence about our individual anxiety. Also, I think a feeling of guilt that a lot of activists have of how can I be talking about my own emotions right now when there's other people that have it so much worse? Like, why should I be asking for attention about this? So what we can do in the Green Fix, or what we try to do, and what I think everybody can do, is focus on building more of an open, welcoming environment to talk about these topics. One of the easiest short-term solutions to eco-anxiety and to associated emotions is just to have a space to share and to have networks online if you're in an isolated area, but also offline, and to have spaces where you don't need to be speaking according to what is socially appropriate within your NGO or within your organization. And to focus not too much on self-care, which is still important, but it has to go hand in hand with community care. Because the more we accept care and support from others, the more we're willing to share some of that ourselves and to offer it. So we do this through our events, through meetups, and through trying to be more transparent. But it is a process, and I don't have all the answers.
Well, that's really interesting, this shift from, the self-care to a community care. We are so used to see all these kind of sectors that suggest you how to take care of yourself after a long day of work, for example. So you can buy your cream, you can buy your product and feel better. That is how you deal with your mental health, And it was interesting as well, because you were saying that you feel a double sense of guiltiness now when you talk about eco-anxiety, a sense of paralysis by the fact that you feel that you cannot do many things to help in this situation. And as well, because in the global south, they have other problems. So you feel as well guilty. So maybe just a few emotions are allowed. For example, one particular emotion is optimism. On LinkedIn, at least the algorithm that I have on LinkedIn, I see many private companies or startups that are so excited to announce that climate change is a wonderful business opportunity. So amazing. We have a polarized context somehow, no? We have these doomers, or people that feel a sense of strong paralysis. And then we have these kind of really climate optimists, and that says we are taking care of that, so we can do that. Technology can save everything, can do everything. So in this polarized context, is it possible to remain an optimistic activist, sharing political achievements to inspire others without falling into, denial or superficial optimism?
Yeah, I think we can definitely still use optimism without it being simplistic or naive. I think it's quite necessary in order to sustain a movement. I think that in our particular culture, we also see our own success as something that has to be measured tangibly within our lifetimes. And so we have a very short-term idea of success and failure, and that impacts our view of the whole world. So optimism that is blind, in the sense of optimism because one day scientists will figure it out and these new technologies will solve the problem for us, that is wishful thinking. That is optimism as a replacement for action. But when we think of optimism, or at least this is how I think about it, in the terms of we have to believe that things can get better, because if we don't, then we create a self-fulfilling prophecy. Climate doomism is very similar to climate denial, in that they both arrive at the same conclusion, that there is no point taking action to protect the climate. And whether you're coming from a space of extreme climate despair or just denying the problem even exists, they're both equally as unhelpful for the state of the world. Even if there is no climate crisis, no social injustice, it is always worth it to try to make things better than they were the day before. And there will always be problems that can be solved. But when we connect everything we do to the state of the world as a whole, it becomes extremely difficult to see reasons to be optimistic. But you will never measure your impact against the state of the world. You can only measure your impact in your circle. So I think when we narrow our radius for what impact is, and we stop expecting that if our individual action doesn't change the world, then there was no point being optimistic, no point being hopeful, then we can find a lot of reasons to be motivated, because change does happen at a local and regional level. And we can be a lot more optimistic about the opportunities for change there than at the global stage. We can also act imagining that we're completely disconnected from the future, because none of us knows what is happening next. We can make a lot of predictions, but ultimately none of us is smart or aware enough of everything happening everywhere to say definitively whether we should be optimistic or pessimistic. A lot of activist movements in the past only saw the results well after generations of activists had died, having lived their entire lives campaigning for something, knowing that they might not see the outcome. If we look at civil rights activists and at feminist movements from previous centuries, they did not stop being optimistic just because the change would not happen in their lifetimes. So we do need optimism, but it needs to go hand in hand with action.
So where can we bring this discourse? Where can we bring terms of physical spaces? Because Green Fix foster community both online and through physical events. Now, for example, in organizing talks and meetups. You published an article that was titled, "It Shouldn't Be This Hard to Find Out What's Happening Around the World," where you were highlighting the difficulties of engaging audience on platforms like Instagram, where words like vote or the growth can suppress visibility. So even if we are trying to use different words, a different approach as well, how can we navigate these challenges while fostering climate action and political engagement?
I think online is an interesting space, because while we are seeing a huge crackdown in what we can say on social media platforms, and we do see how the algorithms on Instagram, Facebook, X, and LinkedIn are less likely to show political content, and they will restrict content that doesn't align with the ideals of their founders. That it doesn't mean that those spaces are futile to work in. I think there's still a value to talking about these things online. We do find ways around the algorithm, and we do create other platforms. Like now we see Blue Sky, we see people actively working to create alternatives. The internet, although it is largely controlled by a handful of corporations.
How is it going on Blue Sky right now?
On Blue Sky right now, it's growing. I've been there since December, but I was never a big Twitter user before, and Blue Sky is a similar format, so I'm not super involved, but it's definitely seen a huge uptick in people that are interested in climate science and in related topics. I think I saw a study that a lot of people who are readers of Nature science journal are on Blue Sky now. That will probably change over time as it keeps growing as a platform. But it is a fairly well-monitored space at the moment. I can't say much in detail because I don't know. I don't know how it will evolve. But, people do have the capacity to create these alternatives online. And we do have also offline spaces. All activist organizing happened offline until a couple of decades ago. And although it is extremely beneficial to have that connection with a global movement in terms of knowledge sharing, we are capable of creating those connections offline as well. And I think we need to tap into those now. This can be informal spaces like the events that we organize, and other sort of networking events and little community events. But it can also be informally. I think we can create more of a connection with our neighbors, with our friends, with being more used to seeing each other face to face rather than relying on online to communicate everything. There were offline platforms before, and they're still there, and we can still use them.
Talking about new spaces to navigate, you were talking about climate change in a very weird place from my point of view, that are comedy clubs. And I find that really interesting because Rebecca Solnit, a journalist of The Guardian, in 2023 noted that the climate crisis is not just a crisis from an environmental point of view, but it's also a crisis in terms of words, in terms of imagination that we create. So we have this kind of narratives that are in between apocalyptic and hyper-optimistic tones, no? As we said before. And the journalist, Rebecca Solnit, suggested that apocalyptic thinking reflects our inability to envision, to imagine a different world from the one that we are currently known. While instead the fossil fuel industry promotes personal responsibility, words and narratives to distract ourselves and to judge ourselves more. You have brought, as I was saying, this discourse in new space that are comedy clubs, that are an unconventional setting, because usually we think that in comedy clubs we are talking about, I don't know, straight couples that are, weird and annoying problems. So what was your experience in that space, and how comedy could help create new empowering narratives to support climate action?
I like that you brought up the concept of apocalyptic narratives as a crisis of the imagination. I know that term comes from a theorist whose name I need to look up, but it's very true that when your only mental options are capitalism based on fossil fuels or the end of the world, that something is lacking there. We need to describe more explicitly what those alternatives are. And that's a whole conversation in itself. But to address your question about comedy clubs, I think that part of the reason that I started that is because although there are a lot of people working on climate issues, we tend to stay in the same circles and the same spaces, and we become an echo chamber whilst criticizing the echo chambers of the far right. So we go to conferences and to marches where we see the same people and we talk about the same topics and we say the same narratives and we talk about how bad everything is and how annoyed we are, and then we all agree with each other and go home. And this doesn't always work internally to create much change. It's just a sort of keeps us in a loop, but it also doesn't change the ideas of people outside this climate bubble or the climate movement who are not engaged either because they're not aware or because they just have other priorities or because they are buying into these stereotypes that climate activism is for hippies or that we're all radical, angry activists. And this doesn't help when the media is constantly presenting biased headlines describing, for example, the Just Stop Oil activists in the UK as sort of angry, inconvenient activists, framing discussions, so-called discussions like, are they really annoying? Has it gone too far? Climate activists don't care about fine art. These ways to shape the public perception that we don't change when we don't talk to people outside of the movement. We do like to stay within our bubble because it's comfortable, but also it allows us to maintain a sense of moral high ground where we know better and all of us have got the solutions and nobody else understands, which is extremely simplistic, and it's in fact the same tactics that the far right use to drive polarization. So avenues like comedy clubs, first of all, help to disrupt some of those stereotypes and to talk to people that you won't find in a climate conference or at a climate protest, but that might be willing to listen. A lot of people, I think, are not engaged because it's a paralyzing topic, as we were saying before, and they just want someone else to bring it up first. So I've definitely found a positive reaction when I started telling jokes about the climate. It was unexpected. People don't hear these jokes. They normally hear jokes about sex and dating. And so it brings something different and something that they haven't heard elsewhere. It also helps to break down the initial defensiveness, because normally if you say that you work in climate, people expect that you're going to start attacking them or criticizing their way of life, and they get defensive. And in a comedy setting, people's defenses are already lowered because they're an audience member. So it allows you to bring up complicated topics. Comedians have always used comedy to talk about social issues and political issues, because it's where you have a more receptive environment. But also for activists, it helps us to relax a little bit, in the sense that if we only ever talk in conferences and in these very formal, serious settings, then we don't ever get a chance to find sources of comedy and to find a bit of humor in the whole situation, which we need in order to stay sane and to keep doing this. So I think all round it's an important space to be
So
in.
you think that the experience that you had in the comedy clubs, you will bring that also in your personal journey in activism somehow?
Yes. Well, I was suggested to try out stand-up comedy after I was doing a series of workshops about climate communications and, these really serious, not funny topics. People would come up at the end and say, hey, you should do stand-up comedy. And I thought, how did you get that conclusion out of me talking about how terrible the world is on a climate level? But it was because of the way that I was talking about it. And I do think that having a more engaging form of communication is important, and that if we all talk like IPCC scientists, that is not going to engage every audience ever. So we need to be prepared to diversify our communications, not just press releases and science reports, but also comedy and music and creative outlets, and talk to people where they're at, rather than expecting people to come to climate-focused events.
Yeah, trying to get out of the bubble, your usual comfortable bubble. I have one last question for you, Cass, today, that was about the future of Greenfix. Where do you envision the Greenfix in the future?
Yeah, that's a good question. As long as I've been running this, we've all been doing it for free. So it's me and some volunteers, and we're all unpaid and we're unfunded.
How many of you?
We have 6 people, and people are involved to different degrees. We like being independent because we know that funding often comes with restrictions over what we say and what we promote, and we want to have independence over that. However, at the same time, it's partially that it's extremely difficult to find funding for initiatives like this. We're not time-bound. We can keep going as long as we have an online platform to do so. But the more our readership has grown, and we are a small publication, but we have quite a concentrated and growing reader base of young professionals in the climate movement. So the more that grows, the more work it is to maintain the same quality of content, to respond to readers that are reaching out, to organize events. We have more requests for collaborations, for guest writers, and that's amazing, and I want to keep doing that. And I need to find a way that we can do that whilst also being sustainable for us, because we advocate a lot for, being compensated fairly and for not undervaluing your work just because it's in a historically undervalued sector like activism or writing. But when we do all this work for free, we do to an extent undervalue the work that we're doing. So I want to find a way to make it financially sustainable, but then the question is how to do that without putting necessary resources behind a paywall. We said when we started that climate resources should be accessible to everyone. It shouldn't be dependent on your income or your understanding of EU bureaucracy. And we stand by that. So we need to think, how can we fund this in a way that allows us to pay the rent without creating a kind of exclusionary environment that we're trying to unmake. So that's a conversation that we've been having in the team. We're also having it with the readers, because we think that if we do go through a paid option, that should be with the reader's endorsement and reflecting what they are able to contribute. But so that's an ongoing conversation. The other part is what we're doing concretely. So we're doing more events. We do a lot of these in collaboration with other movements here in Brussels, but we're also interested in doing it in other cities, to maybe bring some workshops online, to increase our capacity to offer these spaces. I think now people really want a space where they can meet other people that are stressed and burnt out, but that isn't just going to feed into that apocalyptic narrative. So we want to plan more of those, and we want our content to reflect what people are interested in. I think when I started the Green Fix, it was really quite whatever topic was interesting to me at the time. And I also knew less when I started. I was like 22 or something, and had just been working in advocacy for a couple of years. And so it was things like, what is clean energy? And as our own understanding has progressed and as the political situation has evolved, we're keen to draw more of a connection between capitalist economic structures and how that is driving climate degradation more explicitly, the connections between social justice, racial justice, climate action, and to be more explicitly feminist and decolonial, and to advocate for alternatives like degrowth and well-being economies. Generally, my goal is always that if there are enough privileged white men complaining to me on the internet that what I've written is too unrealistic or offensive, then I'm probably going in the right direction. So I want to annoy more privileged corporate men on the internet.
Okay, so in few words, maybe to be more annoying with privileged people.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nice plan. Thank you, Cass.
Thank you.
You've listened to Neoliberal Optimism, a podcast where every 2 weeks I'll explore how the concept of neoliberal optimism may influence behaviors, shape relationships, and redefine what's possible in the future. My name is Arianna Sica. I have a background in environmental economics and currently work in public procurement in Brussels. I'll be joined by thinkers, workers, and activists to bring forward new experiences of collective action.